Hello and welcome to our webinar today on microlearning, improving learning outcomes with a focus on safety critical industries. I'm Grant Crowe, Managing Director of 3T Transform. And we have a group today that will be presenting. We have Professors Roddy Roediger and Mark McDaniel, who are experts in learning and learning retention. So let's kick off by just sharing for half a minute, an overview of the 3T Energy Group. As the name implies, we're focused on energy, but actually more recently, our strategy has been to move into adjacent sectors. And I'll explain a little bit more about that shortly. So 4 operating businesses within the group. AIS Survivex is very well established, the UK's #1 provider of practical training for the energy sector, operating out of the UK, Scotland and Newcastle mainly, but there are other facilities in London and other areas. I run 3T Transform. We provide the software that focuses on helping customers to manage their competence of their workforce, their compliance, as well as their learning to ensure that their workforces are safe and effective. Drilling Systems is the #1 provider of drilling simulations globally, providing both hardware and software to make well operations safer and more efficient. And we've recently acquired a company called UCT, who are the UK's leading provider of power, gas, and water sector training.
Hi there, my name is Lindsay Putterman, and I'm the Senior Director of Partnerships at Trivy. And as such, I manage our relationships with partners like 3T on product offerings like Knowledge Coach. Knowledge Coach is a quiz-based learning platform to improve your workplace engagement and learning outcomes. And our expertise lies in helping people grow and remember critical knowledge long-term and identify knowledge gaps before they become incidents. Now today, we're joined by esteemed professors Roediger and McDaniel from Washington University in St. Louis. You are likely familiar with their bestseller, Make It Stick, the culmination of their decades-long research on retrieval practice, the most effective way to meaningfully increase durable long-term learning. And to kick off their presentation, we're going to walk through 2 questions for your consideration. So the first poll question here, as you're looking at it, think about the last time you went through safety training or any training for that matter. A month later, how much of that training do you think that you'll remember? Research shows that the answer here is 20%. So 30 days after a training event has taken place, the average person will remember up to 20% of what they were exposed to if they have not been exposed to it again. And I always find that statistic particularly startling when you consider that so much of what we do with safety is not a daily occurrence. Many safety protocols occur quite seldomly, and employees are frequently not exposed to the training around such protocols more than once or twice a year. Now, moving onwards to our next poll question. Using retrieval practice, how much of Trivy's large clients remember over that same 30-day time period of their learning? And in this instance, it's going to be 90%. So to put that into perspective, a month after training takes place, if you're utilizing Knowledge Coach to reinforce the salient points of the training, you're going to retain 90% of it. If you aren't using Knowledge Coach or reinforcing, you will retain a mere 20% of the knowledge imparted on you. And when we talk about the impact that learning can have on an organization, it doesn't get more powerful than that. And this really begs the question, how does an organization successfully drive this meaningful retention through retrieval practice? And I think that that's a great segue into our presentation today with the professors. So at this time, I'm going to pass the mic over to Professors Roediger and McDaniel for what you're all here today to hear, which is their presentation.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I'll start off and we'll be telling you about our research. Now, our research is mostly based in school learning, either middle school, high school, or university. But the principles we've discovered apply much more generally to all kinds of training situations. So if we ask how learners often study in classrooms and schools, we've done this in surveys, said you've got a big test coming up. What are you going to do? Well, students say they read and highlight their textbooks. They listen to lectures and watch PowerPoint slideshows and take notes, of course, in class. They repeatedly read their highlights and lecture notes before the exams. And often when they're practicing skills, say in a math class or a physics class, they use block practice. In other words, they practice the same skill over and over to try to burn it into their brains by massed practice, just massing one thing after the other. And often students appeal to their different learning styles. They think they're visual learners or auditory learners, so they try to learn with one type of style. We're going to argue that all of these practices that we've just listed here, although they can be of some use, that they don't lead to durable, long-term learning in most cases. So what should learners do instead? Well, as Lindsay just mentioned, using retrieval practice is, which means simply asking questions and answering them, is much better than repeated reading. In repeated reading, people try to get things into their heads just by looking at it over and over, and that creates a familiarity or fluency, but it doesn't necessarily lead to long, durable learning. Retrieval practices practice getting information out of the heads, that is, using the information, which is, of course, exactly what you want people to do. They're using it to answer a question, but we hope that transfers to other parts of, say, their job or in school, to other topics. The other part is we think you should use spacing as part of retrieval practice. Retrieval practice, answering the same question over and over, one after the other, doesn't really help much. You have to space retrieval practice episodes apart. Also, in many cases, rather than blocked or massed learning, you need to mix it up or use what we call interleaving. That is, practice one thing for a while, then switch to something else, and switch to something else, and back to the first thing, and so forth. Also, as Mark will be telling us, we should forget about learning styles. The evidence shows that what a person believes their learning style to be, or even what tests show, doesn't really matter, that they learn just as well from auditory information if they think they're a visual learning as they do from visual information. So let me just tell you about one study that I did with a then student, now Professor Jeff Karpicki. We had students read 250 word prose passages under one of three conditions. And the prose passages were about science topics, but simple science topics, biology topics, like one was on sea otters, I remember. And in one condition, we simply had students do what they usually do, which is study repeatedly. So we gave people, each S here stands for a 5-minute block of time. So in the pure study condition, people got a passage and they simply read it for 5 minutes, then they stopped for a little while, read it for 5 minutes more, and so forth and so on, through 4 times. We asked them to draw a line each time they read the passage, because you can read a 250-word passage more than once in 5 minutes. And so in that pure study condition, they actually read the passage about 14 times. Then in the one test condition, we had them read the passage for 3 5-minute blocks. They actually then read the passage about 10 times in this condition. And they took one test, one retrieval practice. They tried to recall as many words, ideas as they could. It was an idea test. How many ideas could they recall about the sea otters, for example? And they got about 70%. In the 3-test condition, they read the passage once, 5 minutes. It was actually about 3.5 times. And then they were tested 3 times. They took a test, that paper was taken away. They given another sheet of paper, or maybe this was on a computer, I can't remember. And they recalled as much as they could. And then they did that a third time. And so in the pure study case, they read the passage 14 times. The one test case, they read it 10 times. The 3 test case, about 3.5. And then took a lot of tests. So keep in mind then in the pure study condition, they got 100% exposure to the material every time. But when they took a test, they only got about 70%. So the testing group was at a bit of a disadvantage starting out. Then people were asked, how well do you remember the passage in a week? And that's a hard job. They just judged their on a scale of 1 to 7, not very well to very well. But think about it. I'm giving you a talk now. How well will you remember this talk in a week? It's not a judgment we do very well because we can't predict that far into the future. Then we had 3 groups of subjects that were tested, these 3 conditions, and then they were tested a week later. And a separate group that I'll talk about later was given a test just 5 minutes later, a separate 3 groups. So first I'll show you how well they predicted they would do in a week. What you see on the left is what they predicted. They predicted they would do the best in the pure study condition where they read it 14 times. They predicted they would do the worst in the 3 test condition. If you look over on the right side of the figure at the retention interval that says 1 week, that's what they were predicting. How well would they do in a week? And what you can see there is they got it exactly backwards, that a week later, they recalled the most if they had studied during 1 period and taken 3 tests. If they recalled the worst when they studied the passage 14 times, but didn't take any tests. So we see forgetting is very dramatic in that condition. And what, are people just crazy? No, they just can't predict that far into the future. If you look, remember we gave 3 other groups a test after just 5 minutes. And what you see is after 5 minutes, that's what they were able to predict. That the far left bar and the 5-minute one, the black bar is supposed to go up to 80-something% up there. So what we see is in the 5-minute condition, they did the best, but that they showed huge forgetting over just a 1-week period. So as Lindsay just said, just pure study, like pure reading from a PowerPoint slide show in a training session, that leads to massive forgetting. But if you practice retrieval, even though you haven't been exposed to the information as much in this case, people remembered it much better. I mean, they did show forgetting, but it was just 14% forgetting compared to 52%. And so people have called this finding the illusion of mastery, because when you study a passage over and over and over, you think you really have it. And in a way you do. 5 minutes later, you can do fine, but a week later, you can't. And so that's why we see retrieval practice is much more effective. And when we ask, why do students say they can cram before a test? Well, the repeated study condition is just a cramming condition. And it gets, if students take an immediate test, it gets them through. It's just that they then show remarkable forgetting over a very short period of time, so they don't show durable long-term retention as you get with retrieval practice.
Okay, thank you, Roddy. And Lindsay, what I would like to do for this last part of our presentation is emphasize some of the best practices for implementing retrieval practice. These will be some of the things that Roddy's already mentioned, but I would like to really bring those to the forefront and then present a little bit of scientific evidence for each one of these best practices. And I will also point out how these best practices align with the knowledge coach that Trivy and 3G Transform are partnering to provide people interested in improving training and retention of their employees. So the first best practice is to repeat retrieval practice. The idea is that many people think if they recover the item one time, they've learned it. And in fact, this is the way many students are instructed to use flashcards, especially in the medical sciences, that they might purchase to help them learn. They're told, go through the deck, and when you retrieve the item correctly one time, you can drop that from the deck. Just practice items you can't retrieve. Turns out in our research and other research, that's not exactly the case. Some seminal work that we did on retrieval practice in an online instructional situation, and this may resonate with some of the instructional situations that some of you are handling and guiding. We used retrieval practice. We presented practice quizzes, if you will, online to a psychology course in the biological basis of behavior. Very technical material having to do with neurotransmitters and action potentials down the axon and different brain systems supporting different kinds of behavior. So a lot of technical material. We thought retrieval practice would do very well. And in our initial experiment, we found that when we opened these quizzes up for students, they generally would take the quiz once, get feedback, and then say, I don't need it anymore. Turned out that that did not improve performance on exams for this course. Remember, students are studying the material a lot, they're reviewing it in their online lessons, and one retrieval practice session didn't do the trick. So in a subsequent semester, a couple semesters actually, we set up the reinforcement situation such that students were given maximal credit for repeating the quizzes 4 times over the course of a week. So that is, they're getting retrieval practice 4 times on each item. And then students got decreasing amounts of credit for taking the quizzes less frequently, 3, 2, or 1. But it turns out that with credit given for 4 retrieval practice sessions, almost every student took advantage of that, got the credit. It didn't matter how well they were answering the questions, they got credit for participating. So Lindsay, now let's admit, well, just let me say that what we're going to see is we're going to see the results of exam performances in the class as a function of whether students had retrieval practice on the items or not.
Well, thank you both for taking the time to walk through your experience and research in the space. I know the applications that we see in the corporate world around retrieval practice mirror what you see as well. And it really does beg the question, if you're not reinforcing the learning that you're training people on, why are you doing it in the first place? So I think what we'd like to do now between Grant and I is take a few minutes to walk through a successful case study within the safety space with Phillips 66. And Phillips 66 began using Trivy's platform to solve a rather lofty set of goals. They wanted to institute a culture of learning by increasing engagement in their safety training. They wanted to reduce safety incidents by empowering their employees with the knowledge to avoid errors and risks. And they wanted to be able to immediately communicate new training and awareness around identified risks.
Lindsay, obviously at Trivy, you guys have had great experience working with some leading global organizations, helping them to solve some difficult, generally safety-related challenges that they have. I guess, all of us have been in situations where we are asked to do training, particularly with online training, where we might be doing it alone. And sometimes there's a sense of, I just need to tick the box. I just need to get this done. And then, my boss will get off my back. But clearly with really important topics like safety related training, that really is something that needs to be avoided at all costs. So I guess looking at you know, what I've seen here and how you've described Philips at a high level, clearly you've been able to avoid that, or Philips have been able to avoid that, given the results that they seem to have achieved. And then I guess the second part of the question is, what have you seen in terms of learner fatigue and the retention of that important knowledge over a period of time, and what have they seen?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what it really comes down to is engagement. You know, how do you get learners to engage with the training that you're putting them through so that they're not, you know, just kind of going through and do bare minimum, actually learning it and retaining it as they go. And one of the things that's really unique about the Knowledge Coach platform and Trivy is that Trivy started out as the #1 game in the App Store globally. So when we talk about that, I'm not talking about a corporate game, but I'm talking about trivia games. So if you were playing those on your phone, about 10 years ago, they were likely the trivia games whitelisted. And the reason why that's important when it comes to talking about gamification, when it comes to talking about engagement with training, really, we're in a really unique position of being experts in the space, because we know, based on millions of different data points, what actually gets people to engage with platforms and the content that sits in those platforms. And this is the experience that leads companies like P66 to trust us to drive engagement with what can otherwise be pretty dry content. For the most part, if we look at safety content, it's not exciting. It's dry at a minimum, and potentially something that people don't want to think about at a maximum. And that's what we deliver on. So within the first 2 years of using our platform, P66 saw over 95% of the user base engage with it. And one of the most effective ways to drive that engagement and get people interested in what they're looking at is to add competitive elements like competitions and leaderboards, because people love to win. They love to win individually and as a team. So serving that content that is personalized to the end learner is another important tool in overcoming that check the box mentality, because people have to kind of shuffle through so much content anyways, and then they lose interest. So with a platform like Knowledge Coach, they see that the content is personalized to their needs and to their roles. It's served to them right when they need it, and we make it fun for them too.
Great. Sounds like a pretty powerful package all around.
We like to think.
What other benefits have you seen in the various implementations that you've had? Because, obviously Philips is one of a number of customers that you've worked with to improve the effectiveness of learning.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in addition to engagement and, working with that culture, when we talk about safety training, the #1 thing that we need people to do is to remember what they're supposed to and be able to act on it, and know what those safety protocols and best practices are at the moment you need them. And part of the problem that we see, and this is evidenced by Professor Roediger and McDaniel's work that we just talked about, is that so much of these safety protocols are only taught once, maybe twice a year. And it's not something that people come into contact with on a regular basis. They can frequently be content pieces of if things go wrong scenarios. And as we know, if these instances, knowledge, if it's been months since they were last exposed to it. And what makes that worse is that then it's high stress. And that can make it even harder to recall what to do. So it's not really reasonable to assume that people can reread or re-watch every safety protocol on a daily or weekly basis. That's what they'd be spending all of their time doing. So like we saw at P66, we see this with our other clients, both in the energy space and the manufacturing space, in operations as well. These safety heavy, constituents, essentially. It's not only reasonable for people to recall every safety incident report that they've seen over the course of the year. So we have to make sure that we're giving this to them in bite-sized pieces. And that's what Knowledge Coach does. It serves people reinforcement quizzes at the moment that our AI predicts that they're going to need it. And then it's completely personalized to each learner's gaps. So my drip feeding is going to be completely different than yours. And by doing that, in these bite-sized chunks, we ensure that people retain the information that they need.
Okay. I mean, AI is obviously a massive topic right now and will be for a while to come. It feels like, Trivy is an early user or early adopter of AI, mainly to drive personalization. Is that right?
Yep, that's exactly right. We know that really the two biggest complaints that people have about training as learners is either, I already knew that, so it's not applicable to me, or this takes too much time. So what we have to do is we have to be able to attack those two things and make sure that we're serving people information that they don't already know, and we have the data to prove it, and also things that are applicable to them and don't take hours and hours of their day.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Trivy, the app, has got a really cool front end, very well designed from it. The user experience is great. But looking at the back end, to me, that's potentially even more powerful, because I get the impression that the kind of data available to training administrators, safety managers, people in the L&D department, the kind of level of granularity of that data, what's happening where, what the trends are, that seems very powerful. What's your experience been of that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest, takeaways of looking at a platform like Knowledge Coach, is being able to report on data that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. So pertinent to the conversation we've been having today, we know that people typically remember 20% of what they've been taught 30 days and less onwards after they've been exposed to it. And across our client base, we see people retaining 90% of the learning content they're exposed to, versus that 20% or less that they'll remember if they don't reinforce it. So if you don't remember what the proper protocols are, you probably got a 0% chance of implementing them when needed as you can get. And beyond that, proving and measuring the impact is just as important as the impact itself for a learning organization. Because they need to be able to report on what people know and what they don't know, and what the trends are in learning as well. Yeah,
it strikes me that the back end gives administrators the opportunity to spot maybe common areas where there might, everyone in the business or everyone in a certain manufacturing plant might be struggling with an element of the learning, and then quite quickly being able to sort that out. And it's very difficult to get that level of insight without, the kind of back end data that you provide.
Yep, that's exactly right. One of our clients is in the manufacturing space, and they pushed out a new safety protocol, and we're reinforcing it and assessing it with the Trivy platform. And in doing so, they saw that 89% of their factory leaders didn't understand a necessary step of the new protocol. So if the leaders don't understand the step, then you can't expect for the entire factory to be able to understand that either. So they identified that in real time and were able to push out additional information that was reinforced and measured within Trivy as well, which took care of a liability, and also was, really something that the learning department was able to go to their leadership with and say, hey, look at the impact of what we're doing beyond just, this is how many courses people have taken this quarter.
Yeah, great. So I think that's it, right, on the questions?
Yeah, I think I just want to say one more, because I want to call out that P66 saw a 70% reduction in safety incidents in the first 6 months of using the platform. So do you want to ask if there's any what a business outcome example is?
Okay. Let me think about that. So, Lindsay, just finally, given the focus that we have on safety, what are some of the clear business outcomes that you've seen in your clients when it comes to measuring safety?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it really spans from client to client. Obviously, we can track the trends, what knowledge people are growing, where there are gaps, but it goes beyond that with the Knowledge Coach platform. And that's how with our clients like P66, they were able to recognize over 70% reduction in safety incidents in the first 6 months on the platform. That feedback loop that Knowledge Coach offers really allows learning organizations to be agile and respond to the specific needs of the individuals and organizations, which is how we are able to turn around business outcomes like that.
Wow. I mean, if all customers were able to achieve that sort of result, it'd be incredible.
Absolutely. And I think this has been a great conversation around 66 and some of the other outcomes that we see with the Knowledge Coach platform. I know that we're getting to time here today, so I'd love to be able to pivot to the professors and what they've generously offered for our audience here today, which is to send signed copies of their bestseller that we discussed, Make It Stick, which you're seeing here on the screen right now, to the first 10 organizations from this webinar that sign up for a demo of Knowledge Coach. So as you can see here, if you email sales@3t-transform.com to see a demo, we'd love to be able to walk you through it further and show you the nuts and bolts of how the platform works.